On Monday morning, a helicopter sliced through the New York skyline. When it touched down, a man in handcuffs stepped onto American soil, not a fugitive hiding in the shadows, but a sitting head of state, Nicolás Maduro, removed from his country in the dark, moved through a Brooklyn jail, delivered to a Manhattan courtroom. The Trump administration calls this justice, a law enforcement action, the execution of an indictment years in the making. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Something can be legal in a courtroom and still be dangerous to the world. Because this was not an extradition, it was not approved by the United Nations, and it may have crossed a line. That global order depends on remaining uncrossed. If you care about how power really works, not in theory, but in practice, you need to keep watching. Because before guilt or innocence, there is a deeper question we cannot ignore. Who decides when the law stops at the border? And what happens when it doesn't? What happened in New York wasn't just dramatic. It was precise, calculated, and deliberately framed in a very specific way. The Trump administration insists this was not an act of war. Not a military campaign, but a law enforcement operation, the enforcement of a U.S. criminal indictment against Nicolás Maduro, first issued in 2020. The charges are clear on paper: narcoterrorism, drug trafficking, allegations that Maduro enabled the flow of thousands of tons of cocaine into the United States. From Washington's perspective, this moment has been years in the making. Maduro has denied the accusations. He pleaded not guilty in court, but the case, prosecutors argue, was always there, waiting to be enforced. And that framing matters, because if this is law enforcement, then the rules are different. No declaration of war, no congressional vote, no admission that force was used against another state. Yet almost immediately, legal experts pushed back. They weren't debating the charges, they were questioning the method. And once you look closely at that method, the legal ground beneath this case starts to shift. To understand why this moment is so explosive, you have to step back away from the courtroom and into the architecture of international law itself. After World War II, the world tried to build guardrails. The United Nations Charter became one of them. At its core is a simple rule: states may not threaten or use force against other states. There are only two narrow exceptions: self-defense, if an armed attack is imminent, or explicit approval from the UN Security Council. In this case, neither exists. The allegations against Maduro drug trafficking, narco-terrorism are serious. But under international law, they are treated as law enforcement matters, not acts of war. They do not automatically justify one country sending forces into another. That distinction is everything. Because once a criminal charge becomes a reason for cross-border force, the system begins to bend. Quietly, dangerously. The Trump administration avoided that language entirely. No war, no invasion, just enforcement. But history shows that when law and power blur like this, the consequences don't stay contained. They spread. And the first real fracture appears when theory collides with a single, irreversible act. The fracture became visible the moment Maduro was taken out of Venezuela. According to multiple international law experts, what happened next crossed a bright red line. Conducting a covert operation inside another sovereign country, removing its leader without consent, without extradition, without UN approval, is, in their words, completely illegal under international law. The United Nations Charter is explicit. States cannot simply enter another country to arrest someone. Not even a president accused of serious crimes. Not even with an indictment in hand. This is where the first real crisis erupts. Because the US insists this was not the use of force, just law enforcement. But international law does not work on intention. It works on action. And the action was unmistakable. No imminent armed attack. No Security Council authorization. No extradition request honored. Just removal. If this sounds familiar, it should. History has seen this before. And every time it happens, the same justification appears: necessity. If you're trying to make sense of where the line actually is between justice and power, stay with me. Because once that line is crossed once, it never fully snaps back. And the most important part of this story is what was hidden behind the justification. What's hidden beneath all of this is a legal mechanism most people never see, but governments rely on when they want maximum freedom and minimum restraint. The Trump administration's core argument is simple. This was not foreign policy. It was the execution of domestic criminal law. Maduro has been under indictment in the United States since 2020. That indictment was revised, then enforced. By framing the operation as law enforcement, the administration sidesteps the language that would trigger limits war, invasion, use of force, and that framing has precedent. In 1989, the US removed Panama's leader, Manuel Noriega, and brought him to America to face drug charges. At the time, an internal Justice Department memo argued the president could order arrests abroad even if doing so violated customary international law, including the UN Charter. That memo mattered, because its author later became Attorney General, and because its logic never fully disappeared. US courts have rarely confronted this question head-on. Instead, they focus on jurisdiction. If the defendant is here, the case proceeds. That gap between how someone is brought before a court and what the court is willing to examine is where power operates quietly. And once you see that gap, the next escalation becomes impossible to ignore. The escalation comes when domestic law collides with constitutional limits and no one agrees on where those limits actually are. Under the US Constitution, Congress declares war, but the president commands the armed forces. That tension has never been fully resolved. A Nixon-era law, the War Powers Resolution, was meant to narrow the gap. It requires presidents to consult Congress before deploying troops abroad and to notify lawmakers within 48 hours. In this case, that didn't happen. The Trump administration said notifying Congress would have endangered the mission. A familiar argument. One nearly every modern president has used when acting first and explaining later. And this isn't isolated. For months, US forces have carried out strikes against alleged drug vessels in the Caribbean without formal congressional approval. Criticism followed, but the actions continued. This is the second crisis point, because if operations like this are not considered war and not considered law enforcement abroad, they exist in a legal vacuum, a space where accountability fades. And once that space opens, it rarely stays narrow. The consequences don't arrive immediately. They show up later in precedents, in expectations, and in what future presidents believe they are allowed to do. And that brings us to the people who feel this long before courts ever rule. For most people watching this unfold, the debate feels distant, abstract, legal, but this is where it becomes personal. Because when governments stretch the rules, it's never power that absorbs the risk. It's people. If you're a Venezuelan watching this, the message is chilling. Your president was removed without your consent. Without a vote, without an international process, you could point to and say, this was lawful. And if you're an American, the message cuts a different way. Your government may have acted within a domestic legal gray zone, but it did so by expanding executive power quietly, without debate, without limits clearly defined. That expansion never stays theoretical. It shapes what happens next time. And the time after that. If you've ever believed that rules protect ordinary people from raw power, this moment should make you pause. Because once exceptions become normal, the law stops being a shield. It becomes a tool. If this analysis is helping you see the world more clearly, take a moment to stay with it. Understanding power is the first step toward questioning it. And the effects of this decision won't stop at one courtroom or one country. They ripple outward. Those ripples move fast, and they don't respect borders. When a powerful country demonstrates it can seize a foreign leader without international approval, other governments take notes, not just allies, adversaries too, because precedent is contagious. If the US can frame cross-border force as law enforcement, what stops another state from doing the same? Against dissidents, against exiled opponents, against anyone labeled a criminal by those in power. This is how global norms erode, not with declarations, but with exceptions that slowly become acceptable. The United Nations system depends on restraint, on the idea that even powerful states agree to limits, because once those limits collapse, no one is safe from arbitrary force. This case lands at a volatile moment. Trust in international institutions is already fragile. Geopolitical competition is intensifying, and the line between domestic enforcement and foreign intervention is blurring worldwide. What happened to Maduro won't be judged only in US courts. It will be judged in how other states respond, quietly adjusting their own definitions of what's allowed. And once that shift happens, it's almost impossible to reverse. which leaves one unavoidable question. If this is the present, what does the future look like? From here, the future splits not into certainties, but into three possible paths. Each one reveals something uncomfortable about power, law, and restraint. The first path is the optimistic one. US courts focus narrowly on the charges. Maduro stands trial, and this operation is treated as an anomaly, controversial, but contained. International outrage fades. No copycats emerge. The system absorbs the shock and moves on. The second path is more likely. This becomes precedent. Not loudly, quietly. Future administrations cite it. Other states mirror it. Cross-border seizures are reframed as enforcement, not force. The law still exists, but its boundaries soften. And then there is the darkest path. One where powerful states decide sovereignty is conditional, where accusations replace extradition, where legality is defined only by who can enforce it. In that world, international law doesn't disappear. It becomes optional. History tells us something crucial here. Systems don't collapse all at once. They erode through moments that feel justified at the time. This may be one of those moments, and how it's remembered will depend on what comes next. By the time Nicolas Maduro's case reaches a verdict, the most important decision may already have been made. Not by a jury, but by the system itself. Because this story was never only about drugs, or indictments, or one man in handcuffs. It was about whether power still answers to rules or whether rules now bend quietly around power. US courts are likely to move forward. Legal precedent suggests they will. Jurisdiction has been established. The method may be questioned, but the trial will almost certainly continue. And that is the final paradox. Something can survive judicial scrutiny and still leave the world more fragile than before. If law can be enforced without consent, without restraint, without clear limits, then the question is no longer who is guilty. It's who decides. If you want to understand the next era of global power, how borders, law, and authority are being rewritten in real time, don't look away now. Because this case doesn't end in a courtroom. It ends in precedent, and the next chapter is already being written. If this analysis helped you see the system more clearly, stay with me. The stories ahead will matter even more.